Shalom Kitabet, it's Miss Horowitz, Miss Ellen, whatever way you'd like to call me, and I'm here at my home. Today I'm going to be teaching you about Passover. I know this is very different from what you are used to when we were in class, but I think that this is going to be really helpful to you over time. Now, we won't have a letter of the day today, but I hope to do one next week. But what I will be teaching you all about is our most recent upcoming holiday, which is going to be Passover, otherwise known as Pesach. Do you want to try saying Pesach with me? Here we go. We'll do it one by one, and then you'll repeat after me, okay? Repeat after me. Repeat after me. Pe-s-ah. Pe-sa. Pesach. Pesach. Very good. Good job. So what I'm going to be teaching you about is going to be the traditions of Passover. We're going to get more into the story and what's in that little book on the table every year, the Haggadah, a little bit more later on in the week, but we are going to be first going over the history behind 7 Passover traditions. So I'm going to be showing you over this video and talking with you over this video about a lot of the traditions in Judaism. Now, this comes from an article which was written in Time.com by Sarah Gray called The History Behind 7 Passover Traditions. I'm going to be skipping and changing some parts of it, but if you want to read along, you are more than welcome to. Now, cool thing about Pesach, or otherwise known as Passover, is that this is one of our oldest holidays, while Purim, our most recent holiday, where we all dressed up in costume, is one of our newest holidays. So this is kind of a match between super old holiday, super new holiday. So what we're going to be working on today are the traditions. Now, I'm going to be reading partially from the article, and sometimes I'll stop and talk more with you, okay? So make sure you got your listening ears on and you're paying attention. Passover is nearly here, which means millions of observing Jews all over the world will be raiding their pantries of all leavened breads and gearing up for a Seder, or maybe 2. This year is going to be a little bit different. A lot of us are not going to be going to each other's families' homes or our friends' home to celebrate a Seder. But we could still have Seders in our own home, and we could adjust with what we have in our pantries to be able to do one if your family wants to. Now, there is a reason that we have 2 Passover Seder opportunities. Well, think about it this way. Let's say you have 2 parents, and on one side, your dad's side or your mom's side, they have a traditional Passover Seder, and they like to have it in Los Angeles. But then your mom or your dad's side also has a Seder, and that's all the way in New York City. And you're like, oh my gosh, how do I choose which one I want to go to? I want to go to both. Well, that is why we have 2 Passover Seder opportunities. So that one night you could do it with family, or one night you could do it with friends, or you can switch in between. So it's really up to you and what your family wants to do. But that's why it's traditionally celebrated with 2. But some people also like to do one every night. It really depends on your family and what you guys have in your family traditions. So, in 2020, Passover will begin on nightfall of April 8th and ends on April 16th, which means it's going to be 8 days long. Now, our Jewish calendar, which if you remember is going to be lunar, about the moon, is not like the traditional calendar you use every day, which is the Gregorian or sun calendar. Now, the holiday is centered around the retelling of the biblical story of the Jewish people being freed from slavery in Egypt. Now, if you don't know what slavery is sort of like when someone owns you and makes you work without pay, and you didn't choose to be that. Sometimes people become slaves because of war or because of something else. Now, every family has very different Passover rituals, which reflect family traditions or denomination of Judaism. So, you know how I said earlier in the year there's Reform Judaism, which is what we celebrate. Well, there's also conservative Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism. There's a lot of different ones, all in and between. Now, we're Reform. And the cool thing about being Reform is that we make a lot of our own traditions, even within our own families. For example, during the Passover Seder, you might see on your table something that isn't in this list that I'm going to tell you about below. Sometimes it's going to be orange peels because there was a rabbi who said, oh, girls can't sit at the table until there's an orange peel on the Seder table. Well, in Reform Judaism, we now have girls at the Seder table. So, some people like to put an orange to represent making fun of that rabbi who said that mean thing. Sometimes we put potato peels because the women who were surviving the Holocaust wanted to write down their recipes because they couldn't celebrate Passover. They were in the middle of the Holocaust, so they wrote down their recipes for all the food they liked to make on potato peels, and that's why some people put potato peels on the plate. You and your family might even have an inside joke food that you might want to put on there, but as long as you make sure it's approved with the whole family in mind. So, if you're new to the Passover Seder, maybe your family doesn't celebrate Passover, you've never been to a Seder before, I think that this will really help you kind of get the basics of it. And parents, this includes you. So, why is Passover celebrated is our first question. So Passover is about the biblical story of Exodus. So Exodus is one of the 5 books in the Torah, where God freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Egypt's a country way over here, right? And then over here is Israel. They are not the same country. So the Israelites lost a war, and they had to become slaves to the Egyptians over here. But they were not in Israel at that time. They were from Israel. I hope that kind of helps. So, the celebration of Passover is written in this book, which is Exodus, and they're in our book called the Torah, which is that big scroll thing you see during religious services. Now, we celebrate for 8 days outside of Israel. But if you're in Israel, you celebrated only 7 days. Ms. Horowitz, why would we do that? Why do they have to do different things than us? Well, think about it this way. When I taught you about Hanukkah earlier in the year, I taught you that our dreidels are different in America than they are in Israel. If you go to Israel and you pick up a dreidel, you'll notice that there's a letter replacing the shin, which is the letter that looks like this. It's pei, which is the letter that we learned symbolizing the P letter in Hebrew. Now, on the dreidel, in America, it says, a great miracle happened there, referring to the miracle of Hanukkah happening over there in Israel. But in Israel, you're already there. So the dreidels say, a great miracle happened here, po. That's what that means. Same sort of thing with Israel having only 7 days. In Israel, you know exactly what day Passover begins and ends. But when you're in a different place in the world, like America, which is very, very far away from Israel, you're not sure if you're beginning and ending at the right time of the holiday. So you just add an extra day to be safe and to make sure that you're finishing your days all on time. Now, this story incorporates the idea of springtime, which is when flowers are growing, the idea of a Jewish homeland, Zionism, the idea of family, remembering Jewish history, social justice, and freedom. And right now in your life, you might not feel like you have a lot of freedom. You have to stay home. You can't go to school. You can't play your favorite sport. That's kind of why Passover, in a way, is going to be a really good holiday for you to learn about this year, because it talks about not having freedom and then one day getting it back. So, all these aspects are symbolized, which means that you have, like, instead of like actually crying at the Seder table, you have a glass of salt water. Sort of symbolistic of what actually happened in the story on your actual table. Now, the really cool thing is that Passover has changed over the last couple thousand years. A lot of Passover at first had to do with a lot of farmers and a lot of farmers celebrating springtime. But people who had to move around because of their jobs, they're called nomads, they had to make do with what they had whenever they were traveling. So Passover is kind of like a mesh between these two very different cultural relationships in Judaism itself. Now, what is Passover is our second question. Now, Passover takes place in early spring in the Hebrew calendar month of Nisan. Now, right now, it is March, and next month is April. And April is the sun calendar, which is the one you and I follow to go to work and to go to school. Now, Nisan is a Hebrew calendar month, and that's a lunar calendar. That means sometimes our calendars don't always match up. So even though it's mid-spring for our holiday, Nisan is more of like the very beginning of the spring holidays in Judaism. So in the book of Exodus, which is one of our Torahs, pieces of our Torahs, it commands that Passover has to be celebrated from the 14th day of the month at evening. You shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. Now, what's evening? Is that when the sun goes down? Is that when the moon comes up? What if you can't see the moon? Jews are very smart. We have a very specific system. If you see the moon and 2 stars in the sky, that means it is officially nighttime. Or in Hebrew, we call that Laila. So when Laila begins, we see the moon and 2 stars. And then we can begin or end our holidays, just like with Shabbat. Now, interestingly enough, I mentioned that our calendars don't always match up. So in 2018, Passover started on April 8th to sundown in April 16th. But next year, Passover is going to start all the way in March 27th to April 4th. Very different days. So how are you going to be able to tell when Passover begins or ends? I just use Google. Or you can ask your local rabbi. Trust me, they know. Now, what is a Haggadah? I mentioned this earlier. Well, if you ever go to a Seder, you will notice that on each place that somebody's sitting, there's a book. Sometimes the book is bigger for adults and smaller for kids. Sometimes it's the same book. Sometimes it has art. Sometimes it has music. Sometimes it just has writing. Now, the Haggadah is very important because the Haggadah means telling in Hebrew. That means like talking. Haggadah, ha means the, daga means talking, means retelling the story of Passover. So if we don't have the book, we're going to get lost in the story. It's a very long story, and we don't want to forget stuff so that we celebrate it right. Now, Haggadot go all the way back to the Middle Ages. You're like, Miss Horowitz, what's the Middle Ages? Like, is that the 1950s? No. This is when knights and kings and queens and all of those people, you know, that idea of King Arthur, back in those times into when we first started having Haggadot. Now, in today's Passover celebrations, sometimes we have a lot of political or social justice ideas that have been incorporated into the Seder. For example, in 1969, this one rabbi named Arthur Waskow made his own Haggadah, and he made it to represent the United States civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. talking about social justice. What does freedom mean? And there are so many different types of Haggadot. You might not have one at home, but if you wanted to start to celebrate Seders at home, you might want to choose one that's maybe more about science. Maybe you want one that's going to be more about art. Maybe you want one that's more about women. You can choose hundreds of different types of Haggadot, and it's really good to start that search online as well. And you can get ones in different languages too. They're not all in English and Hebrew. Some of them are in Spanish. Some of them are in Mandarin. So if you speak another language at home, that might be a really good way to connect those two ideas together. So the main fixture of the Haggadah, the main purpose of why we read it, is to read about the 10 plagues, asking the 4 questions, and explaining a lot of the rituals that we do. Now, I'm not going to be explaining the 10 plagues, the 4 questions, and a lot of the Passover rituals. I'm more just giving you a summary of what you will be learning about in the next couple weeks, okay? And if you have questions at any time, you may pause the video, Google it, or you can email me a question, okay? So, what is the Passover story? Like, what's this whole holiday about? Well, in Judaism, every holiday has a big, big, big story. This one is very, very long, but I'm going to give you a little summary of it. So, thousands of years ago, Egypt had a king, and the king's title was not just king whoever, it was Pharaoh. Can you say Pharaoh after me? Repeat after me. Pharaoh. 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 Very good. So, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, was afraid that there would be way too many Jews living in Egypt. And he was like, you know what? I'm going to make you all slaves. And all the Jewish boys, when they're born, have to leave Egypt. They're not allowed here. But his mom was like, oh my gosh, like I don't want my baby to get hurt. I don't want something bad to happen to my baby, but I have to stay here because I'm a slave. So what she did is that she went to this big, big, big river, kind of like the Mississippi River. But in Egypt, it's called the Nile River. And the Nile is very dangerous. And she had to put her baby in a basket that would float on the water and carry the baby away from Egypt. She had no idea what would happen to her baby or if she would ever even see her baby again. So what she did is that she put the basket in the river, right? And it goes down and it goes down. And somebody picked it up. Who do you think picked it up? You'd be right if you guessed the Pharaoh's own daughter. She was by the river at that time, by the palace, and she saw this weird basket thing. She decided to open it, and inside was a baby. And she was like, you know what? That'd be kind of cool to have a baby. So she took the baby inside and raised it as her own. Now, this baby's name was Moses. And you've heard this name a lot in Judaism if you've been paying attention, my friends. Now, Moses grew up in the lap of luxury. He grew up in a palace. He got whatever he wanted. He wasn't ever going to become king, but he was family to the Pharaoh. Now, one day, Moses starts to realize something's up. He doesn't look like his brother or sister, and he's just like, something's not right. And one day, one of the workers who's in control of the slaves, he was an Egyptian man, was really mean to the other slaves. And Moses did not like that. And so he accidentally hurt the Egyptian man. And he was so scared that he had hurt somebody that he ran away from home, all the way out to the desert, away from all buildings, all parks, all family. He just ran. And he goes into this cave to rest. And he sees something very strange. It's a bush, like a bush you'd see maybe outside. But the bush is on fire. You'd think, the fire's going to last maybe an hour, and then the whole bush is going to crumble down, and there's not going to be a fire anymore, right? Well, this bush was different. This bush would burn, but keep burning, and keep burning, and keep burning, and it wouldn't go out. And then the bush started talking. God decided to tell Moses really who he was, and to tell him, listen, you have a responsibility to go back to Egypt and to save your family and to save your people. And Moses was like, what? I'm Jewish? I thought I was the son of the Pharaoh. And they're like, no, you're not. So Moses listens to God, and he goes all the way back to Egypt, and he's like, yo, Pharaoh, you were kind of my dad. Can you let the Jews go free? But Pharaoh kept saying no. So every single time, 10 times, the Pharaoh said no, God would send something down called a plague. Now, this would be something that would be bad, but it would happen more to the Egyptian people who were free in Egypt rather than to the Jews of Egypt who were slaves. One of them was darkness, so you couldn't see anything. There was no sun. Another one was lice, which are like little bugs that get in your hair and make you super scratchy and itchy. Another one was boils, which is kind of like a pimple or something painful, big on your face, but it gets really big and it goes all over your body. And then sometimes even the cows would get sick and get really, really sick. So there was many different types of plagues. But the 10th time Pharaoh said, I will not let the Jews go free, God got very serious. God sent down the 10th and final plague, and it was very dramatic. The firstborn son of the house would be taken away by the angel of death. Now that's really scary, having your first kid, the oldest person in your family of kids, being taken away. So the Jewish people were like, well, wait, what about us? Like, how will the angel know that we're Jewish and that we're not the ones who are, we're the ones who are slaves. We're the ones who should be protected. Well, Moses got this idea from God. He's like, listen, if you take the blood of a lamb, which is like a sheep, if you take the blood of that and you put it over top of your door, so you paint it on there, the angel of death will be like, oh, that's a Jewish person. I'm going to leave that house alone and let them keep their kid. Now, you're like, wait, Miss Horowitz, that sounds like a lie. That's weird. Yes, it was very weird, which is why the Egyptians wouldn't do it. They wouldn't look at what the Jews were doing like, hey, I want to paint my door with lamb's blood today. No, of course they wouldn't. So only the Jews would paint their doors like this. And the angel of death passed over their house and then go down and then go up. Now the cool thing about this is that this was called the passing over. Do you get it? Passover is named after this moment in Judaism. Now, the really cool thing about this is that this is actually what led to our freedom. So after this, the Pharaoh was like, you know what? I'll let the Jews go. I'm very sad that all these Egyptian boys had to leave, and now you Jews are free. So the Jews ran as fast as they could, and they left Egypt, and they spent 40 years trying to get all the way back to Israel, back to their homeland. And it was very, very difficult. Now, what's a Seder? Now, I told you a story, right? You're like, well, this doesn't have anything to do with a dinner. Well, kind of. Seder means order. And remember, that's a long story I just told you. And you have to tell it in order. So this is a kind of ritual that Jews do with food, songs, storytelling. Families hold a Seder on sometimes the first or second night, like I told you. Now, usually you sit at a dinner table in your own homes, and you pray, and you eat, and you drink juice, and you discuss what's going on in the world. So I think this year, if you do have a Seder with just your family, you guys are going to have a lot to talk about. Now, what are some of these symbols? Well, the big one is on this giant plate, which should be on your table. Now, there's different things on the plate. These are the traditional items, and some people add different ones. And if you're vegan or vegetarian, sometimes you don't have some of these. Maybe you have a plastic version. One is a shank bone, usually from a lamb or a cow, and it's this bone. And that's supposed to represent painting the blood over your doorpost. Then you have an egg, and that symbolizes the circle of life, springtime. Then you have horseradish or something very bitter vegetable, and you're like, ugh, why am I eating that? That's supposed to represent how bad it was to be a slave during those times. Then you have my personal favorite, charoset. Charoset is when you mix applesauce with juice and nuts and apples all together, and it is fantastic tasting. And that's supposed to represent what we used to make bricks out of in Egypt when we were slaves. And then usually karpas, which is like a parsley or something like that. And that's green, which represents spring. And then we have salt water. And on the salt water, that's supposed to represent our tears when we were so sad being slaves in Egypt. So that's all on the plate. Now, the cool thing is that we have 3 pieces of matzah, and each one represents something different. You might see a glass or Kiddush cup as well, and there might be one for a guy named Elijah, who's this prophet that we have in Judaism. We leave the door open for him, we give him a glass of wine, and it's really, really cool. Now, you may also see pillows on the chairs as well. This means you get to be seated and be comfortable during that time because you're free now. You're no longer slaves. Now, this is a lot of information, and I totally get it. So sometimes you ask these 4 very specific questions. You might be asked to ask one of them because you're a child at the Seder. So if you're asked to ask one of those questions, we'll go into that more next week. Now, there's some traditional foods that we eat that aren't on the matzah or on the Seder plate. One is matzah ball soup, which is like you take something called matzah, which is this, you crush it up, and you make little balls of it, and you put it in chicken soup. And it's delicious and very warm. There's beef brisket, which is like a sweet beef, kind of like a steak. You have chicken, you have potatoes, but we don't eat bread. Chametz is what we call it. We don't eat pasta or cookies or bread or cereal. Now, this year might be a little bit different for your families. You might eat chametz during those 8 days of Passover. Why? Well, it might be hard for your family to get anything that isn't bread right now because it's very difficult to find food or to go outside when you're in quarantine. So, it's okay if this year your family eats chametz, and it's okay whenever your family decides to do it. But traditionally, Jews tend to not do that. This year, I'll probably have some chametz because I'm not able to go outside. Now, really interestingly, you're like, why do we have to not be able to eat bread? I don't understand. Well, the Jews were running out of Egypt, and they were running as fast as they can. And they did not have time to let the bread rise up big before they baked it. So they put the dough on their back, and they started running, and they let the sun bake the bread. But the bread turned out a little bit flat and crunchy. So we didn't do that. We didn't let it rise. And thus, that reminds us of like, oh yeah, we had to run out of Egypt. Let's make sure to only eat unleavened bread. Now, in this, some Jews decide not to eat rice, corns, or beans at this time, but some Jews decide to. And that's, again, really up to your family and your family traditions. And sometimes you'll see cakes, but they'll be made out of matzah meal, which is crushed up matzah, or other materials that you'll use. Now, this is all the information so far that I'll share with you about Passover. And it's a really nice holiday to celebrate with your families. Now, some of you might be feeling very scared about what's happening in the world right now. And I want you to know that I'm here for you. I miss you so much. I miss you guys. And if you ever have any questions, not only just Passover stuff, you are more than welcome to have your parent email me it, okay? So this is my video for this week, and next week I'll post another video, and it'll be about different things about Passover, like the 4 questions and more the other parts of literature, and hopefully I'll have an activity for you guys and a letter of the day. I miss you all very, very much, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.